Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christine Mungai. I am a writer and journalist, and I am the moderator of today's session, today's Food Literacy Forum, which is the third of 3 forums that Root to Food Initiative has been hosting around the issue of food literacy and everything that that entails. I'm going to give participants 1 more minute to join, and then I can start us off officially. In the meantime, if this is the first time you're joining us, what has been happening on these forums is that at the beginning of the webinar, Root to Food Initiative puts up a poll that they will be putting up in a little bit. So just take a minute or two to vote in that poll. It will just take a few seconds. Let's take a few seconds to put in your answers in the poll. And at the end of the conversation, we'll have a second poll. So there it is, the poll is live. You can go ahead and begin to contribute your answers. And then in the next 1 minute, I'll get our webinar started officially. All right, I think our minute has gone by, and now we can begin. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel. Like I said, it is the third of 3 public forums that we have been hosting on food literacy. The first one was in October, where we talked about the importance of consumers to know where their food comes from. And the second one last month, we discussed the issue of food justice from a climate perspective in the context of the climate crisis that the world is facing right now, what food has to do with justice intersecting with the climate issue of our day. Today's Food Literacy Forum will center more on actionable points for consumers and coming from the backdrop of movements on food. So what are some of the movements that have been successful? What can we learn from movement building around the world, around food literacy and food justice? And the whole idea around these forums is to really interrogate our food systems and to make it salient to us that we can have a just and fair and equitable food system, and that we all have a part to play in making this a reality. I'm really excited to be joined by this distinguished panel. Joining me on the panel is Sidi Otieno. He's a smallholder food producer practicing agroecology for food sovereignty and climate justice. He's also the Secretary General and Policy Advisor of the Kenyan Peasants League, which is a movement of smallholder food producers. I'm also joined by Samson Kirunguge. I think Samson, your connection has finally agreed. So karibu. Samson is the National Assistant Coordinator of Slow Food Kenya, and he's going to tell us a lot more, not a bit more, a lot more about what a slow food movement is all about. So I'm really excited to have Samson on the call and to learn from him on what slow food is all about. And lastly, I'm joined by Leila Liebetrau. She's the project lead of the Root to Food Initiative, a program working towards the realization of the human right to food in Kenya, and part of RTFI, Root to Food Initiative. So Leila, it's nice to see you on this side of the panel and not on the other side of behind the scenes. So welcome. So for those of us attending this webinar, joining us on your Zoom link from wherever you are, if you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, we have a chat window, and we can, I'm inviting you to use that chat function to just share your insights and your contributions to the conversation. If you hear something that strikes you or you want to respond to it, just go ahead and put it in the chat. In our previous 2 forums, the chat window has been a very vibrant space where things are happening just as in an energetic and dynamic way, just as I would be doing on the panel. So feel free to just connect with each other and with the conversation in the chat. And secondly, there's a Q&A window, and we're going to use the Q&A window for questions specifically. So if you have a question for anyone in the panel, please drop it in the Q&A. It's easier to find questions in the Q&A window rather than scrolling through the entire chat, trying to look at where the questions are. So save your questions for the panelists for the Q&A window. We'll be addressing questions as we go along in this conversation. And then for any comments or reactions or reflections, you can put them in the chat window. All right, I think that is all the housekeeping that was there to be done. Okay, so today we're here to talk about movements on food. And we're here to explore consumer movements on food. And consumer movements are collectives of individuals or organizations that advocate for the rights and welfare of consumers, especially when those rights are violated by powerful corporations and governments. This is something that has been going on in many parts of the world. And even right here in Kenya, we have people on the ground who are doing all kinds of grassroots work to organize movements on food. And that's what we're going to be centering on today. So I just want to begin this conversation by directing this question to Leila. Leila, what do you think are some of the prominent food issues that you think deserve the attention of consumers in Kenya, which you think can be addressed through a movement type of approach, going by the work that you've done at Root to Food Initiative? I know there's so many issues that Root to Food covers and that Root to Food thinks are important, but from your view, which are some of the ones that you think are important for consumers to think about from a movement perspective?
Cool, thanks so much, Christine. And yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here. Something I do think about a lot is this idea of a movement. I slightly wanted to break down how we think about this when we say, you know, what is a movement and what is movement building? I think what we're asking for is what is some sort of consolidated response to a stated quo. So what is the status quo? So what is a movement is something that is resisting a certain force in a consolidated way. And I slightly wanted to decouple it from this idea of does it need to specifically be around consumers, because anyone can be part of a movement, right? So if we don't specifically think about it as a consumer target audience. So I feel like what you were asking is if I had redefined it in this way, you know, what we're looking at is what are some of the issues demanding a consolidated response or some sort of agitation, and in a way that cuts across a lot of different people? How can we have a ripple effect, okay? And for me, I think some of the biggest issues are issues to do with power and inequality when it comes to the food system in Kenya and really around the world. I think the reality is that in Kenya, you know, I try to really imagine what this is that this is mostly happening in an agricultural space when it comes to food, not necessarily or not necessarily a consumer space per se. I mean, when I think of consumers, I think of supermarkets. And I'm looking at where the issues are mostly in Kenya and where food is mostly purchased and how it sort of moves along the value chain. And I feel like this is really like a question around how power is unequally distributed in the agriculture sector. And I think this is where it's really mostly undermined. So I feel like something that a movement can respond to in our context is this inherently political nature of food, and the fact that there are these power imbalances, which mean that certain people can access certain food and other people can't, and how producers are able to produce food or not, based on where they're sort of sitting in this like hierarchy of the value chain and what they have access to, and how corporate interests are influencing how we produce food, and not. So for me, this is really the prominent food issue that I think needs attention at the moment, is sort of corporate capture of a food system, power imbalances, and how we can empower small-scale food producers.
Thank you so much for that. The inherently political nature of food. I love how you framed that. And really, you've talked about how all these things can only be deeply understood through a lens of power. It is something that has been coming up in all our food literacy forums that we've held, the past two ones. We spent a lot of time talking about power and inequality. And even when we talk about consumer movements on food, the ccue of power and unequal distribution of options and of the ability to make decisions becomes so salient. Sidi, how does this question land with you? What do you think are some of the issues on food in Kenya that can be addressed through a movement?
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes, thank you so much, Christine, for that question. And indeed, I agree with Laila that the consumers, okay, from my point of view, the consumers have a right to know what food they are eating. They have a right to know who produced the food they're eating, and that's all that constitute what we call food sovereignty, where both the consumers and the producers actually own the food production process. So, and again, the issues of the distance that the food takes to reach the table is also very important. And that's why if you talk about food production, consumers, and climate change or climate justice, then the issues of food miles also come into question. What's the distance? What distance does it take for food to move from the farm to the table? And that's why we are talking about issues of promotion of territorial markets, for example, or producing for local markets, such that once they surplus, then the surplus can be given out to other areas. Another key issue that is very critical is basically the inputs that are being used to produce food, for example. And that's why, as Kenya Peasant League, we are promoting the use of locally available farm inputs from organic manures, organic pesticides, indigenous seeds. Because again, it all starts with the seeds, and the safety of the food is actually guaranteed by the inputs that are being used to produce a particular type of food that is being produced. So the consumers basically needs also to start demanding, for example, the food that is in the that has been processed in the market, for example, issues of nutritional justice. Because sometimes you find that if you go to a supermarket and you find a packet of maybe maize flour, and then look at the ingredients, they just say calcium, what and what. So what about it? They need to know the quantities of such ingredients that are in a particular food. So that's also what constitutes the nutritional justice. But the beauty of localized food being produced by the farmer versus smallholder farmers is that the farmers themselves are guaranteed, if they are producing in an organic way, they are guaranteed of food safety. Also, the issues of linking the consumers directly to the food producers in what we call the establishment of alternative economies, alternative markets is also very, very much critical in the sense that the consumers, maybe in Nairobi, link directly with the food producers in Machakos or in Migori, so that they can be able to transact to remove the middlemen and women who basically pay very low prices to the food producers and charge very high prices to the consumers. So you find that both the consumers and the food producers are actually exploited. And this one, and that's why we talk issues to do with food cooperatives, community-supported agriculture, where the consumers can deposit some funds in a common pool, and these funds are available for the farmers to produce food, and in exchange, the food is given to the consumer. So generally, that's what I would say for now, and maybe I would let somebody else to come in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, CD, for that and for bringing in the perspective of the Kenyan Peasants League and how you see this situation from where you sit. Samson, I'd like to bring you in now. And I would like us to hear a little bit more, just slightly, about what Slow Food Kenya does, and just put that against the background of what are some of the inspiring examples that you know of out there, successful movements that have, gotten some results when it comes to food issues around the world. What are some of the examples that you draw from in your work, just as a way of us to get to understand, like, what does the scene look like when it comes to consumer movements on food?
Okay, thank you so much, Christine, for this particular. Hello, can you hear me?
Samson, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay.
Maybe am I that way? I hope I'm clear that way, right?
Samson, just I think you're either too close to your
Can you hear me?
microphone.
Am I clear now?
I think you are either too close to your microphone or your volume is too high. So if you could just turn it down a little bit. Just turn down your mic a little bit and we'll hear you.
Okay, what about
now? Just say a little bit so that we can hear. Samson, I think your connection is not okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to give you a chance to reset.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of cutting in and out, and I really, really want to hear your perspective, especially on the question that I've just asked. So as you reset your audio, let me hear what Leila has to say on this. When you think about movements, and what are some of when you think about, I know we've talked about the issues that should have the attention and should be addressed from the context of movement building, but what are some of the successful movements that you know out there, and what approaches did they use to achieve their goals? Leila, if you have any examples or any inspiring stories that we can start from, like a positive note. Yeah,
I think, Christine, that the La Via Campesina movement has done very well, starting from, so this is a peasants in the South America, okay? They call them peasants there, but it's just small-scale farmers or small-scale food producers in our context. And the reason that I think is that it's one of the reasons it has been most successful is that farmers came off the field. for a moment or a day or a time, and recognize that the political context, it became a political movement, that the political context, that the context that the farming that they wanted to do and to try and support food and farmer sovereignty, you know, these concepts of having agency and the right to choose, the right to know how they want to farm, and consumers having the ability to know what it was they were eating and how their food was produced. People recognized that this is like, this needed to become a political movement. And so in this way, they started to started to challenge power structures, but also the policies and legislation of how food, that governments were sort of providing in terms of how food should be grown. So I think that this was one of the most successful movements because it understood the politics surrounding farming, and it took it out of just an agriculture sector debate where they said, okay, we want to farm organically or in this way, and this would just sort of be stayed as like an on-farm level conversation. And so this is one of the things that I think has been the most successful. And the other thing I wanted to offer is that, one of the behavioral economists that I've read a lot and really enjoy is Daniel Kahneman. And he authored this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which basically proved the inherent irrationality of human beings. And I know we'll get to this part of a conversation a bit later on, but something that he also wrote is that there is this repetition. He wrote this with respect to sort of big marketing agencies and governments, is that there is familiarity is not equal to truth, but that repetition over and over time there can be a fine line. People start to think that repetition of things that are familiar is equal to truth. And I think that this is something that is important for any consumer movement in the food and agriculture space, is that we kind of need to repeat and repeat and repeat truths around, farmer disenfranchisement, and what we want as consumers, so that then these truths start to become familiar, and in that way that they can become like a powerful force. And I think so it's the same tactic as maybe an authoritarian government or like advertising agencies or food marketers we use, but it would be using it on the basis of truth, not on the basis of trying to sell, fast food or something like that. Okay.
Makes so much sense. Thank you for that example. Samson, I don't know if you can hear us okay, and if you can respond to the question I posed, which was, what are some of the successful consumer movements around the world that are an inspiration to you at Slow Food? And maybe you can tell us just a bit about what Slow Food Kenya does, and especially from the backdrop of movement building.
Okay, thank you so much, Christine. I hope you can hear me right now. Sorry, it's heavy raining over here. So sometimes also the rain is affecting the hearing ability. But I will try to tackle the question as you put it. Slow Food is a grassroots organization that was born in Italy in the year 1999. This was mainly to fight the rise of fast food and fast life, and therefore Slow Food came to work on issues to do with sustainable agriculture, defense of food agrobiodiversity, and also to champion local foods, which is always known to be very healthy, which is always known to be grown sustainably without using the external chemicals that are really known to affect the soil, to affect the crop, and to affect the animal welfare and human health as well. We have a philosophy that goes good, clean, and fair food, which we say that good, we call good food as food that is in season, food that is fresh, food that is that when you eat satisfies your senses, And again, clean because we always try to make sure that we are doing away with the contamination of the agrochemicals. We say that good, clean food doesn't affect the environment, doesn't affect the human health, and does not affect the animal health as well. So it's all about taking care of the environment, human and animal. And also we talk about fairness. We have farmers who really work hard. We have producers, we have farmers who work very hard in their farms, and yet at the end of the day, we don't get fair pay for what we produce. This again comes about issues to do with consumers, and we always say that we can always pay our farmers what they're supposed to be paid, so that they can be in a position to go on putting more effort in producing good food and to give us food that will enable us to be healthy and to prevent us from getting into getting the diseases that are always associated with what we eat. And therefore, again, on the same issue, we did also, there is the issue about the distribution. Like for example, I can talk about Nakuru. Nakuru is a food basket for this country, but yet we have our neighbors from Baringo County who always die because they don't have enough because of the drought and the kind of things. And therefore, we have always been thinking about bridging this gap. Nakuru can we can borrow from we can actually be getting some of these animals that due to drought and the like they die, and and the locals they feel able to eat to feed on these animals. So we can exchange what we have to make sure that these people are not dying of hunger, and also we can have what they have. They have many resources, they have honey, they have many other things, and therefore these are an issue that can be tackled also to assist the consumers, to assist the producers. And on the same issue, we have we talk about labeling of foods the way they should, and most of the food stuff they don't have the labels, the labeling information that they should have. In slow food, we talk about narrative label, which is a kind of a label that tries to bring the information, the whole information into one label of maybe packet of food. And then here, this one actually bears the precise information about the producer and where they are, the companies, the plant, where they are, the variety, we have the plant varieties, animal breeds, also the cultivation techniques and breeding. When we are talking about the animals, the processing, are they looking at animal welfare issues? That's a very important thing that they should work on. And the area of origin, because every time whenever we are buying something, whenever we are eating something, we should know where this food comes from, who produced it, and how. And if maybe you found the food if you found that the food is ready, should also ask to know who produced it and how. So these are the questions that we keep, that we always ask every consumer to ask him or herself, to make sure that we are, to make sure that they enjoy the food that they have on the table. And maybe something else I can talk about is issues to do with, somebody mentioned about bringing, connecting the consumers and the producers. These are kind of a gap that should be bridged to make sure that these two people understand each other. When they come close together, the food becomes cheap for the consumer and it becomes fair for the producer. And that's what slow food does with what we call other markets. These are farmers market that whereby we bring organic products and make sure that the consumers and the producers come close. They come on board, and they're able to exchange all this information, and they are able to get, the consumer is able to get good food, and the farmer or the producer is able to get fair pay for his or her produce. Before I get that's what I can say for now. I will add more later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samson, for that wonderful overview of what slow food is all about. And really that kind of food system addresses so many issues of what we've been talking about in the past 2 or 3 conversations about food being equitably and sustainably and fair and just, that everyone in this chain or in this sequence of relationships is treated fairly, is properly remunerated, that the food is nutritious, it's safe, it's produced in a way that is sustainable and that is fair and just. Leila has just posted in the chat the slow food philosophy. Slow food envisions a world in which all people can access and enjoy food that's good for them, food that's good for those who grow it and good for the planet. I mean, that's just a wonderful way to encapsulate everything that we've been talking about, and really our vision for what food justice looks like. Food that's good for people, that's good for those who grow it, and that's good for our planet. All right, I'm going to shift our conversation a little bit, and Leila had begun by talking about power in her first answer, right? The idea that so many of our issues in food systems have to do with power and inequalities. And the truth of the matter is that most of our African governments are heavily influenced by multinational corporations and by global financial capital. We don't live in a bubble, but we are really living in a context where our governments desire to be more attractive to investment. And by investment, they really mean foreign investment and not really local investment. For some reason, they don't see their own citizens as investors. But because of this desire to be attractive to investment, many governments are willing to tolerate such things as anti-competitive practices or receiving low quality imports than would be acceptable in other markets. I know that this, if you're a regular on Twitter, you see this comes up quite a bit. People comparing the quality of an item that they bought in Kenya with the same brand that they bought somewhere else, and you realize that the quality is so different. Governments kind of tolerate increased exposure to hazardous waste. We know that so much of the waste in the global north is actually not recycled. It's just dumped somewhere in the global south in different countries. How do you think consumers can have more voice and a bigger say to really address these issues head on when they're caught on the underside of these high level decisions that seem to take place in places that are so far away from us? I don't know if Sidi is back on the call. I think he needs to rejoin. But Leila, how do you think that consumers can find their voice and rather than feel so kind of so helpless and that they don't have a way to like address these things that seem so distant but yet affect our lives so directly?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. I mean, something that I think around tonight, maybe I want to know if it resonates, with the others and some of the participants, is that I think a lot of the time is we don't know when we're being caught on the underside of decisions. And so when we don't know we're being caught, then how do we know, how can we find our voice? So I think one of the important things is to, and something I always try to encourage, our Root to Food team and even members of our alliance, is just to think more critically around the status quo, to entertain the idea that there is an alternative perspective and an alternative way of doing things. And I think, I did this in university. It was probably the best course I ever did, called Critical Thinking 101. And it's just to sort of say, like, there are other ways of thinking and doing things. And I think this is important, not to always take things for face value. And it's a little bit, I think one of the other things is that we can do in terms of having a voice on issues that we are familiar with or that we do know is to appreciate that, the vulnerabilities of especially private sector, this idea of follow the money really comes to mind. And really the vulnerability is around their economic success. And sometimes when I get overwhelmed by these very big high-level processes and decision-making where I have absolutely no influence or say, is I have to bring it back around, okay, what can I do in my small life? And what am I doing either to support a system or to challenge it? And for me, this is around really how I spend my money. Who am I choosing to support? Okay, by what I buy. Am I buying from which supermarket? Am I trying to sort of, fulfill this philosophy that Samson's described by, closing this huge gap between producer and consumer? Can I buy from farmers who I know and how they're producing this food? So can I support this movement and this vision that Slow Food Kenya has? And this is for me really how I feel I can take the power back. It's not always an option for everyone to be working in a job that they basically also feel so, such a strong connection to. But I have the fortune of also spending my every working day doing things that I feel like are important in my personal space as well. So that's what I would want to offer in response to this.
Thank you so much for your response. And it dovetails so well with what CD just posted, that Kenyan Peasants League envisions a Kenya where farmers practice family farming, agroecology, and organic food production systems. And they control the means of food production for food sovereignty. In the, just exploring the idea of where our power lies, just what CD was talking about in his earlier response. When we narrow that gap between producer and consumer, when the food that is produced in a particular community is actually destined for the people in that community, rather than being beholden to corporate interests out there somewhere. Leila, I really love how you've challenged us that the way things are not the only way that they could be, right? That there are different ways of making these arrangements and thinking about food and food systems, right? Leila, I see your hand before I bring in CD again. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I just think one of the biggest challenges is that there are so many problems and issues in the global south, as you called it. I mean, everywhere in the world, but particularly in our African countries. And I think this really makes it difficult to be able to decide, okay, well, why would we movement build around food and food sovereignty? And I think this is really where attention comes, and perhaps why we don't see as strong a response in certain countries as we would expect to see or hope to see. Yeah.
Leila, that brings me directly to my next question. As I was doing my reading around this and just drawing even from, the experience that I have in studying movements around the world, I came across this, I know that they've been successful ones, for example, on infant breastfeeding, a lot of movements that have really promoted the health of people. I'm thinking about how our constitution in Kenya that we promulgated, that word, in 2010, really guaranteed citizens certain rights. It was it's a constitution that has a very progressive view of what citizenship is and the responsibility of the state towards citizens, to guarantee safety, for example, to guarantee certain rights to Kenyan citizens. But sometimes the legal framework is not all that's needed, right, to build a successful movement around any kind of issue. In India, for example, India was in this context of like heavy multinational corporate financial interests going on in agriculture in that country. And when they passed the Consumer Protection Act back in 1986, it was believed that we would see a lot of consumers would go to court to sue powerful corporations. But what ended up happening is that the consumer movement really struggled to make an impact because they did not organize in a way that demonstrated the strength of these organizations. And in some ways, consumers kind of remained passive and kind of apathetic and unaware of some of the options that they had. But at the same time, the organizations found themselves that they didn't have enough funds, or really they didn't make the traction that they wanted to make. So we began this conversation by talking about some examples of successful movements. But also, I want us to learn from what hasn't worked and why, right? Maybe we can start with Samson. Do you know of, from what you have heard and thought about in Kenya, and even from examples from outside of Kenya? But I really think that if you have a Kenyan example, it would be so helpful. We have a constitution that guarantees these things from that legal and constitutional angle. But what can we learn from examples where these movements fail and why, so that as we organize, we know what to avoid? Samson, do you have any insights on this?
Thank you so much, Christine. I think what I can mention about, we have several organizations that have been trying to do this. One is the Kenya Organic Agriculture Network. I think they have been working very well in terms of offering PGS for the organic products that are produced. And again, they always try to bridge the farmers to the consumers, and again, they always try to make sure that these consumers get what they need, get what they need in terms of healthy food, because that's the reason as to why they brought about the issues to do with the participatory guarantee system, that is, certifying the producers who produce organic foods. And therefore, when we are talking about issues to do with consumers not really having access to contaminated foods because of the increased use of agrochemicals. So, and therefore, what I would like to say is that this is one of the movements that I know that has been trying to make sure that these things are done away with. And another one is we have another one that is called Organic Consumers, we call it OCA, Organic. We'll check on it. I will get back to you about it. I can't remember very well, but it's all about, it's a body about protecting the consumers that are always going to buy organic products. But outside there, we always have farmers who always hear that some of the organic products are expensive, so they want to coin each and every product that is produced, whether they know whether it's organic or not. They want to say that this is organic so that they can fetch more money, just like the other farmers. So these are the two that I know of. And of course, for us, we keep making sure that the consumers know about their rights as well as the producers, so that they can continue having access to food that is good, food that is clean, food that is fair to the both sides.
Thank you, Samson, and it's nice to have you back, CD. I'm just going to redirect this question to you, CD. What are some of the reasons that consumer movements struggle to make an impact? And what do you think should be top of mind in terms of lessons for anyone who is interested in movement building around food, which I believe is all the people who are on this call today, with that desire to really make a difference in this issue of justice around food?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm sorry I had some connection problem, but I've sorted that out. Well, most consumer movements operate in isolation. Yeah, because you find that, and again, you find that most of these consumer movements are in urban areas, and they don't have a direct link with the food producers. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, because when the consumers are not basically linked directly to the food producers, then you find that the consumer movements are basically focusing more on the consumer rights, but based maybe on industrial food, for example. So that particular disconnect between the consumer movements and the actual food producers is one of the issues that is a very big challenge. And I think moving forward, there's a need to have linkages between these consumer movements and the food producers. Because, for example, you find that most of the food that is consumed in urban areas are basically, maybe if they are maize flour, they're maize flour that has been made, I mean, from maize that has been imported into the country. We have had situations whereby, like I know during COVID-19, for example, there was a facility, a World Bank facility that gave Kenya to respond to COVID, and with a rider that the maize, I think the consumer movements also need to go just beyond the right of the consumers to know, but again, pushing for government to allocate more resources in buying food from farmers. It is very sad that at times you find government paying maybe for a 50-kilogram bag or 90-kilogram bag of maize, they're paying 1,500 to farmers. But when they're importing this maize from Mexico, they pay over 6,000 shillings. So you find that there's also a very big, I can call it injustice. Yeah, so I think also the consumer movement also needs to push for government to allocate more resources to food, especially the smallholder food producers. And also they need to also actually ensure that they also speak to policies around food production. Yeah, so because today if the consumers say, okay, we are not going to be buying maize or maize flour that is produced from industrial seeds, then definitely the government will have to. So they need to go beyond sloganeering, going to the streets, but again, now mobilizing the consumers to start buying food from the smallholder food producers. If you go to Kangami market, for example, you go to the local markets, you find that when the consumers go to Westgate, for example, to Carrefour, it is written 500 shillings, they don't bargain. But when they come to the market, so they get those mamambogas, they want to bargain, you see. So we need also to tell our consumers that they also need to, they need to, they also need to have, just like we have trade fairs, we also need to have, spaces where the consumers understand the work that the farmers undergo to produce food. So that when that mama tells you, you have to pay this for my tomatoes, then you have to understand. But most consumers don't understand the work. So they also need to have some small kitchen gardens, even in the urban areas, so that they can even understand the pain and the energy that the farmers put. Yeah. So I think the consumers are very critical in pushing for farmers' rights, for example. Yeah, that's what I would say for that.
Thank you so much for that, CD, and especially for bringing it so close home that you have to go beyond the right to know, right? Beyond this rights discourse, but more direct linkages between consumers and producers to really care about what farmers go through, right? And to choose to spend your money to support these small scale farmers who need your support much more than those multinational supermarket chains and corporate interests, right? Thank you for bringing it home in that way. We're coming to the, I guess, second half or last third of our conversation, since it's almost to the top of the hour. And over the past 3 forums, we talked a lot about what can be done. And Leila said earlier that, the way things are is not the only way that they can be, right? But I just want to kind of make this more real and more tangible to all of us here, whether you are a farmer or having an organization or just a consumer, or in whatever capacity that you have joined this webinar or you're watching this webinar. It's really difficult to work against those feelings of disempowerment and frustration when you think about these corporations and governments who are driven by the profit motive. Sidi, you just said that the Kenya government can spend twice as much to pay some foreign imports rather than local farmers, right? Without even seeing a contradiction in that. It's really hard to work against those feelings. And I know that it's important for us to always remember that these powerful interests are not as invincible as they seem. All of these kind of forces have vulnerabilities, right? Leila, I'd like to direct this to you. How can we better recognize these points of vulnerability and learn how to focus our efforts, right? Rather than feeling kind of overwhelmed by that feeling of this is so much for me. If I just buy from the farmer that I know, my local mama mboga, but at the end of the day you feel like, is it really making a bigger dent in this much bigger problem that is much bigger than all of us? How do you think we can better learn to think of ourselves as agents as empowered actors? Let me put it that way. In this system that is so animated by power.
Yeah, I mean, Christine, I don't know if I've got much. I mean, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, where, to recognize the points of vulnerability, is I would say that this is in its economic sense of private sector. And the way that I try and make this practical for me is by making sure that my purchasing decisions either would undermine or just don't support the further growth of this consolidation of power. And these are big words, but at the end of the day, it just comes down to what are you supporting, who are you buying from, and this sort of thing. So I don't know that I've necessarily got much new to offer that. I think maybe on a slightly more abstract level, I think one of the important things is, I think when it comes around decision making, and especially in groups, and this is why, we reflected on why some maybe movements or initiatives that you're part of are not successful, is because I feel like groups, formations, alliances, whatever you call them, even if they're not formally registered, I feel like they often get stuck in not so much an external communication or an external action, not there, but they get stuck actually in their internal processes of decision making. And, I've seen this with formations that we're trying to create or have tried to create under the Route to Food initiative, or at least to support. But sometimes it's not about necessarily a lack of funding, but this idea of, what should our objective be, or our goal, or our mission statement, or our values, and then things get they just reach to a point where they stagnate. And so then the spirit and the energy can be there to support some sort of change, especially around community supported agriculture. Let's look at this initiative. You could have something small as a group of people who have a common philosophy. They know they might want to support a certain farmer for X, Y, and Z reason. And at the end of the day, it probably comes down to being able to share the cost of a food basket, or get food slightly less expensively. but then there might be like some difference of opinion around where food should be procured from or bought from, or you know, who organizes something. Or I mean, these are, you know, I'm really trying to disaggregate it here, but these smaller things can often, and disagreements can often undermine or pause or stall or frustrate an energy that might have otherwise been quite impactful had it been seen through. And what I would want to offer this is that that formations and movements that have a common vision shouldn't get stuck, but rather to take this idea of like, rather to take a risk or make a decision and run with it, see how it goes, recognizing that things can always be changed if it's not working out or reflected on in a couple of weeks, in a month, etc., etc. And rather try than not try at all, and then you just never know.
Thank you so much for that reflection on, and if you've ever been part of any kind of group, you know how difficult it is to align people, even if on paper they're actually on the same team, right? A lot of times these movements fail to make an impact, not because people are fighting against each other, but it's something actually quite small when it comes to a disagreement about tactics or alignment or prioritizing strategy. And for some reason, like, it's those little things that make people feel stuck and actually make movements not successful. Samson, I want to bring you in just to ask for your reflection on what Leila has just said about how to actually organize in groups and what to do with that feeling of disempowerment and frustration. Do you have any tips or advice for those of us who are watching or have joined this webinar?
Thank you, Christine, for the question. Yeah, I really agree with what Leila has just said. And for sure, you know, always being organized in groups is always one way to solve different problems, because sometimes you cannot solve a problem when you are always alone. You need inputs from others. You need to work together with others so that you can be in a position to look at the vulnerabilities that you have as a person, as a group, as a society. And I think it's always very important to reflect on these together so that we can come up with you know, most of the time we have common problems, we have common challenges, and together, once we sit down, once we come together, it's always one way to come up with possible solutions to these kinds of vulnerabilities that you just mentioned about. There is one thing that we always say as slow food. For example, when we talk about anything that we are purchasing, you know, just to make sure that we are making goods, you know, to make sure that we are always making good decisions when it comes to what we are buying for us to consume or even to use. And we always say that when you are purchasing something, use your head. This is because sometimes you can keep purchasing lots of stuff, and sometimes they end up into wastage, because sometimes you've purchased, for example, and sometimes after you consume what you need, you end up losing the other. So it's all about again, yeah, coming together and having conversation with each other and coming up with possible solutions that of the various problems that are facing us as a person, as a group, and as a society. So I think that's what I would like to say as far as Leila talked about. Thank you.
Thank you, Samson. I see Edwin in the chat, and he says the issue is more than structural. From the history of policies governing food politics, where in the colonial context, native and settler farmers operated in different regimes. That's the reality in this country. And this has been carried forward to ensure policies do not favor consumers and small producers. That kind of like framework in some ways remains quite powerful. What should be done is to do situational analysis, training, and to build alliances between producers and consumers to speak with one voice. As CD said, as a consumer, what is happening with the producers matters to you, right? And just emphasizing on those linkages between consumers and producers is really important. And Edwin, thank you for your contribution on that, for us to think of ourselves as part of the story of food production in Kenya. Part of that story is the story of consumers, right? And figuring out a way to speak more powerfully with one voice. Okay, I see we don't have any open questions on the Q&A window. We have reached the top of the hour. And so I just want to open this up for any specific questions to the panelists. Feli, if you can help me to unmute maybe Edwin, that's the only person I see with their hand up. And he can bring in his contribution. We'll take about 3 or so comments or questions, and then kind of move to our final question of the day and to the final poll as well. Edwin, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
I'm really enjoying the discussion. And the issues that are being raised are issues that have been part and parcel of this discussion, because I've been part of these food security, food policy issues from the 90s. And as you are saying, building alliances has been very difficult because the interest of players sometimes are different. But one thing that I would want to say is that a lot of things have changed. A lot of dynamism has come in. We are talking about globalization. We are talking about the overuse of agrochemicals and all this. We are also talking of consumer education around organic food and all that. So the best thing that we can do, as I said, is that can we do some kind of context analysis? Where are we with all this dynamism? And from there now we see what are the gaps that we need to address. And from those gaps, how then can we move forward to build those alliances that can help us now advocating for the right policies? Because there are so many policies that many farmers and many consumers do not know. Some are really beneficial, but because they have not been shared with them, they do not know the good things in those policies, but they also do not know the bad things in those policies. So building these alliances will also help us in addressing the emerging issues. And from those alliances now, we'll now see how food is moving from the farmer to the consumer. And we are managing that kind of the value chain. So those are the issues that I'm looking at that we need to deal with so that we talk from facts and figures so that we reach also what we call the critical mass. The other time we talked about how can we develop a manifesto, because now we're in election period. Can we develop facts and figures manifesto that we can share with the political leaders, those who are seeking the big offices, so that in the next, when the next government is coming in, we'll be able to look at those issues and follow up with them. So those are my issues.
Thank you so much, Edwin, for linking that with the fact that we are already in an election cycle, I would say, but where is the voice of the consumer? Where is the issues that we have been talking about in this webinar and in our previous webinars? I see a few comments and questions coming in the chat window. Delia asks, is there a place for corporates who are looking at connecting organic farmers and large retail chains? She says not all corporates are bad, and they are an important part of the value chain to improve smallholder farmers' welfare and also marketing to the consumer. CD, do you have a response to this? Where is the place for corporate organizations who want to connect organic farmers with the large retail chains, and where do you see the place for corporate organizations, which in some ways could be described as the middleman, but kind of like a rehabilitated middleman out to do good?
Yeah, my take is that those who don't produce food have got no business talking about food. Yeah, because when what is motivating them is profit. So whether you are telling us that you want to promote organic farming or regenerative agriculture, and you are a corporate organizations, all corporations are motivated by maximizing profit. And what we are saying is that the farmers themselves should not be just be reduced to food producers. They should own the market. The farmers should own the distribution systems. And that's why in terms of alliance building, the alliance building here between consumers and producers should be to be able to ensure that they take the total control of the food production system. Because you find that when a corporation is perhaps telling us that they want to link the consumer, the food producer to maybe supermarkets or urban-based consumers, then it means that I think it's disenfranchising the food producers. So I think what we are talking about here is a situation whereby the collaboration between the consumers and the producers ensures that food is moved at competitive prices, for example, because you find that we have got companies or groups that say, okay, we are promoting organic farming, but again, you find that they still push for single crop, you see, which is again a threat to diversity. So to me, I think that moving forward, both the farmer or the food producer movements and the consumer movements should actually now focus on creating structures that can support the distribution of food between the consumers and the producers. The issue of funding, for example, to the smallholder food producers. And I've seen somebody asked in the Q&A about the allocation to the agricultural sector. You find that it is actually way below what was agreed in Maputo of 10% of the GDP food production. It is, like as Leila said, it is below 4%. And even that 4%, you find that 80% or so goes to recurrent expenditures, supporting forums, things like that. And again, then you see that the remaining goes to large-scale food producers. So, and just as Edwin pointed out in the chart, is that the policies that we have have not changed from what we had in the pre-colonial or the colonial days, where we had the natives and the settlers, and with the different policies. Look at our seed laws, for example. It's still promoting that. So to me, I think if a corporate wants to support farmers, let them give the farmers funds to be able to support their systems, to be able to move their goods, but don't come and tell us, okay, fine, we want to give you this, and then we're going to buy food from you and take it somewhere else. And that is what has actually been. And again, such corporates again should focus on strengthening territorial markets, strengthening local markets. You find that most of our local markets, if you go to Mario Market, where I come from, in the 80s and 90s, on a market day, like on a Wednesday or on a Saturday, by 8 in the morning, the market was full. Why? Because the farmers are producing food consumed locally. But when we have corporates or corporations coming under the guise of promoting organic farming, but telling farmers to produce food that is not consumed locally, that is what has killed our markets. We have to recapture those markets. We have to tell our farmers to produce what is eaten locally. Look at what's happening with the avocado sector, for example. The hash, I don't know if you got the hash avocado, where the farmers are told, okay, fine, you grow this avocado, take it to China. Then all of a sudden, the Chinese are telling us, no, the residue, the chemical residues in this cannot allow them. So you see, the farmers themselves cannot eat it locally. There's no market for it locally. So we have, yes, if there are those corporations or those groups, let them support farmers in recapturing the local markets. Let them support farmers in creating systems that can enable the farmers, for example, farmers coming together and creating warehouses where they can store goods. Consumers also linking them directly through them. The consumer supported, the community supported agriculture. And again, maybe lastly, we need to build and strengthen the market systems owned by both the consumers and the producers. We need to connect, as I said earlier, the rural agroecological food producers and urban consumers, and actually creating a network, what we call in KPL, the homestead to homestead partnership, or farmers to consumers partnerships. Because, you know, we have been hearing about PPP, public-private partnerships. But as consumers and for food producers, we can be able to partner with government. The government doesn't need to partner with a corporation from maybe US to come and help us here. We can form strong movements of farmers, strong movement of consumers. Then we have partnerships. Maybe we have farmers to county partnerships. We have to support farmer cooperatives, for example. So such corporations need to put resources, because the idea is resource. They need to put resources without conditions, without telling us that we are giving you this, but you also have to buy a television set to pay on loan. We are giving you this, but you also have, no, we don't need those conditionalities. If they're coming without conditionalities and they're helping, not helping the farmers to, with a clear vision that in 5 years we want to see farmers in Awendo have formed strong cooperatives. They have even bought their own vehicles that can be able to move goods to Nairobi, for example. We have strong consumer movements that are also perhaps coming and seeing what the farmers are doing. And that's the whole idea of the food cooperative that we are trying to create as KPL. So as long as the corporations are putting profit ahead, then they don't have a place in agroecology. They don't have a place in food production system. And that's why we are saying that food should be removed from trade. The WTO has got no business regulating food, because that's where the corporations get the ways to come and distort food production systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, CD, for those powerful sentiments, and really bringing it home that the profit motive cannot be the one animating our right to food. Food should not be considered a commodity in that way. And for everything that you've shared, CD, thank you so much for that reflection. Sylvia is on the webinar today, and she says, Sylvia Kuria, she says, we need to move from being keyboard warriors to making real choices to eat safe organic produce from small-scale farmers. Many times we talk about what we should do, but we rarely take action. She says, at Sylvia's Basket, we have made organic food affordable and thus accessible to more consumers. And I know that there are several other organic farmer networks and organizations that are doing this. And this basically has been a refrain, I can say, in the 3 public forums that we've had on food literacy, that you actually, as a consumer, have more power than you think, right? And that your choices matter. You may not feel like they matter, but they actually do. And Sylvia, thank you for bringing that into the conversation. About organic certification being made simpler and cheaper to the common organic farmer. In our first forum, Emmanuel was one of our panelists, Emmanuel Atamba. I see he's here on the webinar. And he talked about we should actually be more creative in how we certify and do this kind of processes, and not necessarily be completely bound by the way that things are done, in this formal official way. He talked about community certification of farmers, right? That these relationships that we have with farmers can act as a way of certifying what they're doing, right? That we can build on our own local networks and kind of local knowledge systems and relationships to actually certify that this person here is someone that can be trusted to produce this kind of food that we are looking for. And so certification doesn't necessarily have to go through this very expensive kind of formalized way. I thought that was really rich and helpful in rethinking what certification could be, that as the community, you could actually be the one that is certifying. And I think this kind of works in other contexts. If you're in a merry-go-round or a chama, like how do you actually know someone's credit worthiness, right? It's kind of like community sanctioned, right? And so we can think bigger and more creatively about what these certification and guarantees could look like in our context. So our time is fast spent. I just want to, before I ask the last question, which I am going to direct to Leila, just to thank you all for making the time to be here. Thank you for engaging with these important issues. As the moderator, I've really been challenged by what I've heard in today's webinar and in the previous ones, to really think of myself as someone with more agency than I think, and whose decisions matter more than I might be aware of. So thank you everyone for making the time to be here. In a few minutes, Feli is going to put up the last the last poll. But before she does, Leila, you had begun to bring the issue of behavioral economics and consumer psychology into all this, right? People are complicated. You know, if you've spent time with any other human being, you know that people don't always do what's best for them, even when they have all the information available, right? Sometimes a lot of these conversations are coming up against certain forces that may not be as straightforward as we think, including the tactics of marketing firms and how our cultural practices are shaped, right? How does this issue of consumer psychology and behavioral economics complicate the efforts of advocacy groups who are doing wonderful work that everyone agrees is important, right? How can we kind of process that through this issue of people not always doing what they know is right? That's a reality.
Yeah, so look, I don't really have an answer for this question, not unless you want to fundamentally hardwire the human brain and change human nature. So I mean, science and research we know has shown that, you know, we all think we're much more rational than we are, and we think we always make good decisions, and that we've got reasons for our we have, you know, good reasons for our decisions. But the reasons are only seemingly good because we've actually already made the decision. And so, yeah, look, I don't have a straight answer for this. I think when it comes to consumer movements, Christine, I think it's important to appreciate that, you know, movements exist in this context where, you know, this is how people think, and what this is fast and slow thinking, rational, irrational thinking, and people make decisions very impulsively in the moment. So, you know, buying a McDonald's or a Kentucky Fried Chicken can seem like a great idea at certain times, instead of buying one of Sylvia's baskets. I think it's important to appreciate this is the context that we're in and what it actually calls for. And I think for me it reiterates that we're working in, I think, a very broken global food system, where we need to really restructure and rechange how food is grown, and what we consider food to be. And this is really challenging. I mean, I'm a bit philosophical around it, but this is really challenging, I think, like capitalist modes of production, and not considering alternative economies and other ways of, you know, existing. So yeah, look, I don't know, all I can say is I don't know how it complicates efforts of consumer movements. I just know that it does, and that the movements themselves are comprised of human beings that have the same ways of thinking about the food. We're all sort of prone to these same problems, I guess, or these same errors in ways of thinking. So yeah, I think it's just a stronger message that we need to really challenge. I think this fast food network, this fast food model, I think, that keeps this very, like, keeps trying to penetrate and influence the kind of food that is available, and how and how we and it's cheap, you know, and therefore what we want to buy. If that makes sense. Yeah, a bit disorientated. A super hard question, my dear, to like.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
a good place to end this conversation, to always realize that even as we speak in ideals and sometimes in abstractions, at the end of the day, we are all human beings. And everyone, I think, is on a journey. And anyone who is on this call, on this webinar, kind of found themselves in a certain position and has seen themselves on a journey, right? As a farmer, as an activist, as a consumer, there's a way that people change and grow and understand issues and make certain commitments. And movements are only successful when they're able to get people from one step to another. CD, I see your hand up. Any final comments as we conclude on our panel today?
Yes. Maybe I just want, I just want to conclude by saying that, as I've seen in the chat, somebody, Ben Kafusi, has asked whether they could support in terms of resources for training the local people in remote areas. I think this is a very critical question because, as I said, that funding is a key issue. The only avenue that the corporates get to food production is because they are providing resources. And that's why, even as because whoever funds you has a reason. And we need to actually start pooling our own resources. For example, because we find that if you look at even Nairobi, we have got a lot of research organizations, and they are talking about the right of farmers, but they still go to supermarkets. So can we start by saying that all activists, for example, need to stop buying food in the supermarkets and be linked directly with a food producer somewhere? That's the first point. Then secondly, all of us, I think most of us here have got monies in bank accounts, in KCB, in Barclays, just sitting there. Yet the farmers in the rural areas are grappling with the resources. So that's why in what we are trying to establish as Kenya Peasant Treaty, the food cooperative is a circle sort of, whereby instead of me keeping my funds in a bank that is owned by a corporate, then we can create these big circles or small circles linking farmers and producers, so that I can deposit my fund in that particular circle, and another farmer somewhere can access that fund and buy and use it to produce food. And again, when the food has been produced, then me, depending on what I put in that particular fund, I can be able to access that particular food. So I think that's one of the ways that we can be able to support food production. And again, the trainings that are removing farmers from the farm is not the right way to go. Our training should be practical based. They should be based on the farms, because our farmers have got a lot of knowledge, indigenous knowledge, that has not been documented, for example. So we need to like have farmer to farmer dialogues where the trainings are on the farm, and the farmers themselves are actually the professors. They are the ones who own the knowledge. But we have seen researches taking place, which is mining information from the farmers and going to package it and again using it to sell to the farmers. So my point is that yes, we need support for trainings. The trainings needs to be on the farm, not removing a farmer from Butare to Nairobi to sleep in rice regions. In fact, the farmer will forget the problems. Taking hot shower, he'll forget their problems. So we need the trainings needs to be on the farm, so that when we're talking about maybe producing organic manure, it is done practically on the farm and the farmers can be able to run. Thank you so much. And thanks to Root to Food for organizing such a good event.
Thank you so much, CD. Samson, any last comments? Samson, if you're with us.
Sorry, my network was misbehaving. Could you kindly repeat your question?
Oh, I was just inviting you to give any final or closing comments as we finish on the webinar.
Okay, I have much to say other than thanking the team that came up with this platform for discussion and exchange, and also to remind the consumers wherever they are. I think we are all consumers because whoever eats consumes something. We either eat or we either buy something. Therefore, I would like to remind each one of us that whenever we are whenever you're buying something, let us remember that let us always remember that it's an act that is very important to all of us, that we should that actually plays a part in terms of helping one part and also creating an impact on the other. And therefore, thank you so much for this session, and hope to see you next time. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I think the poll has already been shared, and the results, I believe, are coming in. If you haven't given your response on the poll, please go ahead and do so. But in the meantime, I just want to say thank you to our wonderful panel today for such incisive comments and helpful insights and really practical advice. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your insights, your contributions. They're very well received here. Leila, thank you. Thank you, CD. Thank you, Samson, for making the time to be here. Root to Food Initiative is going to continue with this series of public forums later, early next year, going into the new year. But this was the third of three, the final of this particular series on food literacy that I have moderated. And like I said, I've really been enriched myself as the moderator. I think that is all from me. Feli or Leila, if you have any announcements or logistical stuff that you want to share with our attendees today, you can go ahead and do it. Otherwise, I've really been honored to be part of this, and thank you for the invitation.
Cool. I mean, thank you, Christine. I don't have any, Ophelia, I don't know if you've got any administrative stuff, but just maybe just to say thank you so much, Christine, for your really, really solid moderation and preparation for the last three forums. It's been such a pleasure to be working with you because yeah, you really do spend time and you hold space well. And I think this is critical to the success of the last three. So yeah, thank you very much as well. And that's all.
I think Leila has said it all. Thank you once again, Christine, and thank you to the panelists, and also a big thank you to all the participants who have joined us all through, and also who joined us for this last part of the forum. See you next year. Yeah, thank you. And I hope you all can join the Root to Food Alliance. I've shared the link on the chat.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, bye.